Welcome back to that 90s pod, everyone. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty heavy topic.
Yeah, a tough one, but an important one.
Yeah, definitely. And before we get into it, if you're digging these deep dives, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button and tell a friend about the show. So today we're talking about the Rwandan Genocide.
100 days in 1994, 800,000 people killed.
Yeah, it's just mind-blowing. And I think it's one of those events that people know about, but maybe don't fully understand the complexities of it.
It's definitely more than just a horrifying statistic. You have to look beyond those numbers to really grasp the roots of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about Rwanda, I think about the Belgian colonial past and how that kind of laid the groundwork for a lot of this ethnic tension.
Exactly. Rwanda's colonial history is really key here, specifically how Belgium ruled and how they kind of fueled this division between the Hutu and Tutsi communities.
So they didn't just inherit these tensions, they actually made them worse.
Yeah, it was a very deliberate strategy. They used this classic divide and rule tactic, favoring one group over the other, and then sometimes switching those roles just to maintain control.
Oh, wow. So cynical.
It was. And it wasn't just a cultural division. They actually institutionalized it with things like identity cards, further solidifying these groups in people's minds.
So even after Rwanda gained independence in '62, this manufactured division, it was like a ghost that just wouldn't go away.
Absolutely. It cast a really long shadow.
Yeah.
Post-independence power largely shifted to the Hutus, and that marginalization of the Tutsis, combined with years of ingrained prejudice and fear, created this incredibly volatile situation.
Like a powder keg just waiting to explode.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
the assassination of President Habyarimana in April of '94 was the spark.
It's crazy how quickly the violence escalated after that assassination.
It's chilling. Habyarimana's plane was shot down on April 6th, and within hours, the meticulously planned extermination of Tutsis and even moderate Hutus began. Years of propaganda and hate speech, much of it spread through this radio station. RTLM had really dehumanized the Tutsis in the eyes of many.
Wow, RTLM radio television, Libre de Mille Collines. What a name.
It's a chilling reminder of how media can be used for such horrific purposes.
Yeah, it makes you think about how powerful media is even today and how susceptible we all are to, manipulation.
It's true, and what's really striking about RTLM is that it wasn't some fringe outlet. It was incredibly popular. They would play music crack jokes and then weave in this incredibly hateful rhetoric.
Like normalizing the unthinkable, making it part of everyday life.
Exactly. It made people complicit, or at least passive, in the face of this rising tide of hate.
And it's just wild to me that the world knew all of this was happening and didn't immediately intervene.
It's a really dark chapter in terms of global response. The world's reaction was hesitant and ultimately inadequate. Many Western nations were still scarred by events in Somalia and were hesitant to get involved.
Like a not our problem kind of attitude.
Right. And that indifference played a direct role in the scale of the genocide.
This event really forced the world to face some tough questions about responsibility to protect vulnerable populations.
Right.
I mean, we all say never again after the Holocaust, but it seems like those words rang pretty hollow in 1994.
Absolutely. The Rwandan genocide became a turning point, a horrifying lesson that led to the development of the responsibility to protect doctrine, or R2P, in the 2000s.
So it's like a global acknowledgement that, sovereignty can't be a shield for atrocities.
Yeah.
But it's heartbreaking that it took such a tragedy to get there.
It is a tragic catalyst for change.
Before we move on, I just want to remind our listeners, if you're finding this deep dive insightful, please hit that subscribe button and share with your friends. The more we understand the past, the better we can shape the future. Now, let's talk about the cultural impact of the genocide. I mean, such a massive event, it had to have left a permanent mark.
It did. The world couldn't ignore what had happened in Rwanda. It forced a global confrontation with issues of race identity and human rights.
Right.
In the late 90s and early 2000s, we saw a surge of books, documentaries, and films exploring the genocide and its aftermath.
Hotel Rwanda comes to mind. Yeah. It was a really powerful film, though I know it was also controversial for maybe oversimplifying things a bit.
It's true. Hotel Rwanda is a good example of the complexities of representing such a multifaceted event. It raised awareness, but also sparked debate about who gets to tell these stories and the dangers of simplifying a nuanced narrative for a mass audience.
It's like you want to make it accessible, but you don't want to lose the complexity in the process.
Exactly. It's a tightrope walk for sure. It's a really important conversation to be having, and it highlights just how difficult it can be to raise awareness about a complex issue like this while still making sure you're representing everything accurately and with nuance.
It really does. And speaking of complexity, it makes me think about Rwanda itself and the challenge of rebuilding a nation after experiencing something so horrific.
Rebuilding after genocide is a monumental task. There's so much to address.
Exactly. I mean, we talked about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but what about the more tangible aspects of rebuilding? Like,
Yeah.
how do you even start to put the pieces back together physically and economically?
Well, in terms of physical and economic rebuilding, Rwanda has actually seen some pretty remarkable progress. Under Paul Kagame's leadership, they've had incredible economic growth and have become one of the fastest growing economies in Africa.
Oh, that's impressive. So they've really focused on rebuilding infrastructure and things like that.
Yes, they've made big investments in infrastructure technology, and they've even been attracting tourism, all while trying to create a sense of national unity.
That's amazing to hear. But I also wonder, is that economic progress something that's felt by everyone? I mean, how do you heal those deep societal wounds that run so deep after something like this?
Yeah, that's where things get more complicated. While there's been a lot of progress, there are definitely critics who say that it comes at a cost. Some argue that Kagame's rule has been authoritarian and that there are concerns about human rights violations.
So it's not a simple success story.
Definitely not. And even the economic progress doesn't always reach every community. Healing deep societal wounds takes a lot more than just economic growth. It requires addressing the root causes of the genocide, like the ingrained prejudices, the economic disparities, and the political manipulation that allowed such hatred to flourish.
That's a really important point. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Exactly. It needs a much more comprehensive approach. So I think that's one of the most significant challenges that Rwanda faces today.
It makes you wonder how any nation can truly heal after something so horrific. What lessons can we learn from Rwanda's journey, both the successes and the struggles?
I think a key takeaway is that true reconciliation can't just be forced or imposed from the top down. It really needs to be a grassroots effort that involves open dialogue, addressing past grievances, and rebuilding trust between communities.
It sounds like a really delicate and long-term process.
It is, and it requires a lot of patience and understanding. And what about the international community? I mean, what role do we play in all of this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do we just kind of step back and say, okay, you guys figure it out, or is there a more active role we should be playing?
I think the international community has a responsibility to not only remember what happened, but to actively learn from it. And that means supporting Rwanda's development, but also holding its leadership accountable for human rights and democratic principles.
So it's about finding that balance between support and accountability.
Right. And it's also about making sure that the aid and support we offer actually empowers local communities rather than creating dependency. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Yeah, it seems like there's this constant tension between wanting to help, but not wanting to overstep or impose our own values.
It's true. And I think navigating that tension requires a lot of humility listening and a willingness to learn from those who have been directly impacted by the genocide.
And it's a reminder that we can't just pat ourselves on the back for creating things like the R2P doctrine
Yeah.
and then consider our job done. It's about ongoing engagement, understanding, and a real commitment to supporting a future where these kinds of atrocities never happen again.
Absolutely. The Rwandan genocide is not just a historical event. It's a stark reminder of how fragile peace is and how important it is to be vigilant against hatred and intolerance.
It's a lesson that resonates not just in Rwanda, but everywhere in the world, wherever there are divisions that have the potential to erupt into violence.
It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in preventing these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
You know, we talk a lot about the 90s here on the pod, but this event, these 100 days, they really pierce through any kind of nostalgia or romanticized view of that decade.
It's a sobering reminder of the darkness that humanity is capable of.
And it challenges us to learn from the past and really commit to building a better future.
And it highlights the importance of individual action, like remembering, learning, speaking out against injustice, and supporting organizations that are working towards peace and reconciliation. These are all ways that we can contribute to a more peaceful world.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, we wanted to remind you all, if you're finding this conversation valuable, please hit that subscribe button and share that 90s pod with your friends. We believe that understanding the past is crucial to shaping a brighter future. Now let's continue exploring the legacy of the Rwandan genocide and what it means for us today. Welcome back to that 90s pod. We've been talking about the Rwandan genocide, and it's a story that really stays with you. You know, even 30 years later, there's still so much we can learn from it. About humanity, about global responsibility, and about the power of memory. As we wrap up this deep dive, I keep thinking about Rwanda today and what it tells us about the possibility of healing after something so horrific.
It's a question that's central to Rwanda's experience. On one hand, you see this incredible resilience, a nation completely devastated, picking itself up, trying to rebuild not just its buildings and its economy, but its entire social fabric. It's remarkable that Rwanda even exists as a functioning nation today. It speaks volumes about the strength of the human spirit.
Yeah, but we also can't forget the complexities. We've talked about the criticisms of Kagame's government, the concerns about human rights. Is that something that overshadows the progress they've made, or is it all just part of this messy reality of trying to rebuild after a genocide?
It's a tough question. There's definitely a delicate balance there. It's important to acknowledge the progress they've made, the economic growth, improved healthcare and education, the focus on unity. But at the same time, we have to be honest about the challenges, the limits on political freedoms, the suppression of dissent, and the trauma that still affects so many people in Rwanda.
It's a lot for any nation to grapple with. So how do we make sense of all of this as outsiders looking in? Do we just say they're doing the best they can, or do we hold Rwanda to a different standard because of what happened?
I think it's about understanding that there's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to healing. It's not a straightforward path, and it's going to look different for every individual and every community. There will be times of progress and times of setbacks. It's messy, and that's okay. I think our role as those trying to understand is to listen to different perspectives, to acknowledge both the good and the bad, and to approach it all with empathy.
So basically, there's no simple conclusion to this story. The Rwandan genocide, its legacy, the efforts to rebuild, it's all still very much unfolding.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep talking about it, not just as a history lesson, but as something that still has relevance today. What happened in Rwanda forces us to look in the mirror and confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our capacity for cruelty and indifference. But it also shows us that even in the darkest of times, there's hope. Healing is possible, even if it's imperfect and never really finished.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just something in a textbook. It shapes who we are, and it's up to us to learn from it so we can create a better future. And maybe that's the most important takeaway from our deep dive into the Rwandan genocide, the responsibility to remember to learn and to do something with that knowledge.
And to never stop asking questions, to never stop trying to understand, and to never give up on building a world where never again actually means something.
It's a heavy topic, but as we've seen, it's also one filled with so many layers and even some glimmers of hope. We hope this deep dive has given you all a lot to think about. And as always, if you enjoyed this conversation, please hit that subscribe button and share that 90s pod with your friends. We truly believe that the more we understand the past, the better equipped we are to build a future where these kinds of tragedies never happen again. Thanks for listening.